Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever wondered what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable heart? What happens when a mind engineered for conquest, discovery, and reinvention encounters something it cannot analyze, optimize, or automate? Emotion. This question, though ancient, finds a modern resonance in the life of one of the most driven, restless innovators of our time. And perhaps the real question isn't whether anyone can tame such a force, but whether the human brain, wired for relentless innovation, can coexist with the unpredictable rhythm of human love. You see, I've spent much of my life studying the human brain, how drive manifests, how focus becomes obsession, and how love, paradoxically, can both sharpen and soften those edges. And what I've come to realize is this: the human mind that builds rockets to Mars and neural interfaces to merge with machines is also the same fragile architecture that yearns for connection, understanding, and peace. When we talk about high-performing individuals, people whose goals seem to stretch beyond the limits of reason, we often describe them as unstoppable, unbreakable, almost superhuman. But neuroscience tells us something different. Beneath the relentless ambition lies a fragile equilibrium between dopamine-driven pursuit and oxytocin-driven connection. One fuels progress, the other fuels meaning, and without balance, even the most brilliant mind begins to fragment. Now imagine a man who spends his life pursuing impossible goals, colonizing other planets, redefining transportation, reinventing energy, and imagine that same man facing something even more complex, another human being who doesn't orbit him, but mirrors him. A woman who doesn't compete with his intelligence, but complements it. Not a rival, not a follower, but an equal force of nature. The human brain is curious in how it reacts to such encounters. When two high-intensity individuals meet, both driven, both visionary, the brain experiences what neuroscientists call limbic resonance. It's not mere attraction, it's synchronization. Their emotional and cognitive rhythms align, creating a deep sense of mutual recognition. It feels less like falling in love and more like remembering someone you've always known. But here's where it becomes complicated. The same neural circuitry that drives innovation, primarily centered around the prefrontal cortex and dopaminergic systems, thrives on novelty, challenge, and future orientation. Love, on the other hand, depends on stability, trust, and emotional predictability, functions primarily governed by the limbic system, and the release of oxytocin and serotonin. These systems compete for neural dominance. In other words, the very brain that can design reusable rockets might struggle to maintain reusable emotional stability. So, when we ask, is this the woman who will tame him? We're really asking a deeper question: can genius ever find equilibrium? Now, let's go back to something fundamental: the nature of drive. People often romanticize ambition, but biologically, ambition is a controlled addiction. Dopamine, the molecule of motivation, doesn't reward us for success. It rewards us for pursuit. That's why the chase, the next innovation, the next launch, the next impossible goal never truly ends. For a brain wired like that, peace feels like boredom, and boredom feels like failure. Enter someone who disrupts that pattern, not through confrontation, but through understanding. A woman who sees the storms behind the steel, who doesn't try to change him, but reflects him, showing him that not every battle is external, and not every victory requires a launch pad. That kind of presence can recalibrate the brain's reward system. It's not a taming, it's a rebalancing. And yet, love at that level requires immense courage. Because when you connect with someone who lives at the edges of possibility, you're entering a gravitational field that distorts everything: time, emotion, and sometimes even reality. People like that live in perpetual acceleration. Their sense of normal is chaos. Their version of love isn't always calm, it's catalytic. Neuroscience has a term for this too: emotional plasticity. It's the ability to adapt our emotional responses in environments of constant change. Some people's brains are wired for stability. They need routine, predictability, safety. But others, the innovators, the explorers, need volatility. Their dopamine pathways require friction to stay alive. The right partner doesn't remove that friction. She transforms it into fuel. And perhaps that's what makes this particular story so intriguing, because in him we see the embodiment of unrelenting momentum. And in her, we see the quiet gravity that could finally slow him down just enough to breathe, without extinguishing his flame. Let's step away from romance for a moment and talk about neuroscience again. There's a study from the University of Zurich that examined the brains of entrepreneurs versus those of traditional professionals. The difference wasn't intelligence or creativity, it was risk tolerance, specifically linked to the amygdala and nucleus accumbens. Entrepreneurs had lower amygdala activation in response to uncertainty, meaning they felt less fear where others felt danger. But love activates the same neural circuits as risk. Falling in love, for a brain like his, feels like standing on the edge of a launch tower. Exhilaration and terror in equal measure. This is why some of the most driven individuals often keep their love lives private. It's not secrecy, it's protection. When your mind lives in the future, love demands that you live in the present. And for some, that's the hardest challenge of all. Now imagine that within this vortex of rockets, data, and global enterprises, there is one person, one singular woman, who can walk into the room and the noise simply stops. Not because she demands it, but because she understands it. She doesn't try to outthink him, outwork him, or outshine him. She does something infinitely more powerful. She sees him. From a neurological standpoint, being truly seen activates mirror neurons and triggers oxytocin release, which in turn lowers cortisol, the stress hormone. It's a biological grounding. For a man whose mind is constantly at war with time and possibility, that simple act of being seen can feel like landing after 1,000 liftoffs. But can it last? Can two forces of such different energies sustain equilibrium? That depends on one thing: emotional congruence. You see, in every relationship, there's a psychological equation that determines harmony, the alignment between one's inner world and the other's emotional bandwidth. If his storms are met with her calm, and her silence is met with his curiosity, the system balances. If not, it collapses under its own brilliance. I've seen this pattern not only in innovators, but in scientists, artists, leaders, individuals who orbit greatness, but sometimes lose touch with gravity. Their relationships succeed not when they find someone who calms them, but someone who matches their wavelength. Someone who doesn't slow them down, but changes the way they move. Now, this might sound poetic, but it's deeply neurological. When two people share synchronized emotional rhythms, their heart rates, breathing patterns, and even brainwave frequencies begin to align. This is measurable through fMRI and EEG scans, something we call inter-brain coherence. In high-functioning couples, it's a literal neural dance. Their brains learn each other's timing, creating a symphony of responsiveness. When that happens, when logic meets empathy and fire meets water, we witness transformation. Not taming, not control, but transcendence. And maybe that's the real story here. Maybe the question isn't, will she tame him? But, will she understand him enough to help him heal what ambition alone never could? Because behind every restless innovator lies a silent wound, a fear that stillness means insignificance. It's a paradox: the more he builds for humanity, the harder it becomes to be human. The more he reaches for the stars, the further he drifts from the heartbeat beside him. Yet every now and then, someone enters that orbit, not to tether him, but to remind him that gravity is not the enemy. It's what keeps us real. When that happens, when the heart reclaims its place beside the mind, something miraculous occurs. Creativity deepens, compassion expands, innovation becomes empathy in motion. And the man who once tried to build a world beyond Earth may finally start building a home within himself. There's a fascinating study from Stanford University that looked into what happens in the brain when high-performing individuals experience emotional attachment. Researchers found that when people who thrive on intense focus begin to form deep bonds, their brains start to reallocate resources. Cognitive energy, once spent on goals, starts flowing toward connection. The same dopamine system that once fired for success now fires for stability. And for someone whose life has been defined by acceleration, that shift can feel like a loss of control. But that's where the transformation truly begins. Because when the brain learns to associate safety with stillness, not motion, love with peace, not pursuit, it begins to rewrite its own wiring. That's neuroplasticity in its purest form, the ability of the mind to adapt not just to new technologies, but to new forms of emotional truth. I've seen this happen in real life many times. You take someone who has spent decades building empires, every hour consumed by the next meeting, the next design, the next breakthrough. Then one day something, or someone, makes them pause. For the first time in years, they notice the silence between the moments. They realize they've been solving for everything, except themselves. In that pause, the human brain performs an extraordinary recalibration. The limbic system, the seat of emotion, begins to communicate differently with the prefrontal cortex, the seat of logic. It's not a battle anymore. It becomes a dialogue. Emotion and intellect begin to collaborate. That's what true balance looks like, not a taming but a synthesis. So, could she be the one who tames him? Maybe not in the way people imagine, because taming implies restraint. But what if it's not about restraint? What if it's about resonance? What if the one person who can meet that kind of mind doesn't hold him back, but helps him hear the frequencies of his own heart? When I talk about resonance, I mean something literal. Our emotions emit measurable frequencies. When two people emotionally connect, their electromagnetic fields begin to synchronize. The heart, not the brain, becomes the conductor. The HeartMath Institute demonstrated this. Two people in deep connection can experience measurable alignment in their heart rhythms, even when separated by distance. Imagine that. Two people living at the edge of innovation, feeling connected across time zones and galaxies. It's not fiction. It's biology. And maybe that's what's unfolding here. A kind of partnership that doesn't compete with purpose, but complements it. A union that redefines what balance looks like in the life of a visionary. Because when the mind and the heart align, even the impossible begins to look achievable, not just for humanity, but for the human behind it all. Let's talk about what this kind of connection does to creativity. In fMRI scans of artists, scientists, and entrepreneurs, we see that love, genuine, secure love, increases activity in the default mode network, the region responsible for imagination and introspection. That means love literally expands the creative canvas of the brain. When a person feels seen and safe, their cognitive flexibility increases. Their ideas become more integrative, their problem-solving more elegant, their vision more human. So, love doesn't just soften genius, it evolves it. But here's the hard truth, not everyone can handle that evolution. When a person's identity has been built on motion, success, and chaos, peace feels threatening. There's a deep subconscious fear that if they slow down, the brilliance will fade. That if they open up, they'll lose the armor that kept them safe. That's the paradox of the visionary mind. It thrives on momentum but craves meaning. And sometimes, the greatest act of courage is to stop running, if she truly is the one who can meet him in that space. Not by silencing his storms, but by understanding them. Then what we're witnessing isn't the taming of a man. It's the awakening of a soul that's finally ready to rest without losing its edge. You see, the narrative we often impose, that love must soften, strength, is wrong. The most powerful relationships don't weaken ambition, they refine it. They teach it purpose, they give it roots, not walls. They help brilliance remember why it burns. In psychological terms, this is called secure attachment in high-functioning individuals. It's rare. Less than 7% of people with extreme goal orientation ever reach it. It means they find emotional security without losing autonomy. They love without fear of dependency, and they build without the terror of isolation. For people like him, that's nothing short of revolutionary. So, if there is a woman who can help him reach that equilibrium, she's not taming him. She's translating him, translating chaos into clarity. turning genius into grace. And that's the beauty of it. She doesn't need to change him. She helps him understand himself. Let's step back for a moment and consider how this looks through the lens of human evolution. For millennia, the survival of our species depended on a balance between exploration and connection. The explorers pushed boundaries, the nurturers built communities. But the most successful tribes, the ones that endured, were those in which explorers returned home. They didn't abandon their curiosity, they channeled it into creation. That's what's at stake here, not whether he can be tamed, but whether he can return home to himself. Whether he can learn that love doesn't limit greatness, it sustains it. I've often said that true intelligence is not measured by IQ or innovation. It's measured by adaptability, the ability to evolve when life demands a new form of strength. In that sense, love is the highest form of intelligence, because it forces us to grow beyond logic, beyond control, beyond fear. And for someone who has spent his life mastering the external universe, maybe the final frontier is the internal one, the place where silence teaches what noise never could. Let's imagine for a moment the two of them, not as headlines, not as icons, but as two human beings. She understands the weight of his world, the sleepless nights, the constant expectations, the noise of millions of opinions. And he, for perhaps the first time, feels what it means to be accepted without performance. That's not taming. That's transformation. Because when a mind like his finally finds someone who looks at him not as a visionary, but as a person, when love stops being a distraction and becomes an anchor, the impossible starts to look inevitable. And maybe that's the quiet answer to our question. Maybe she's not the woman who tames him. Maybe she's the woman who finally teaches him that he doesn't need to be tamed. That peace doesn't kill purpose. That love doesn't dim fire, it focuses it. Every great mind eventually learns that what it was searching for out there, on Mars, in the code, in the stars, was never out there at all. It was here, in the quiet connection between two hearts that beat at the same impossible rhythm. So, is she the one? Science can't prove it. Logic can't predict it. But if she can stand beside him, not behind him, if she can love the mind and the madness, the dream and the danger, then maybe, just maybe, she's not here to tame him at all. She's here to walk with him into the only frontier he's never truly explored, stillness. And if that's true, then for the first time, the man who built rockets to reach the stars may finally learn to see the beauty of being grounded. Because sometimes, the greatest act of innovation is learning how to simply be human.